under our floorboards. She's under there somewhere.
Well, if she's under there, you want to dig your floorboards up. The chances are, in front of the high altar, we know that in front of the high altar were the relics of St Oswald, and were Aethelflaed and Aethelflaed. We know that they were there. There's no conclusive evidence. It's considered to be the case that certainly during the dissolution of monasteries, things like relics became very bad form, stuff like that. Obviously, things like St Cuthbert in Durham, they would try to destroy them. They dug them up and they destroyed them. I mean, they threw them into rivers and things like that. So in all likelihood, they would have disinterred and chucked them in a river. But we just don't know. So I reckon that you should go home and get a spade. I think we've got some volunteers.
We know that in 1974 they did an archaeological dig there. We've got photographs of it, where they dug the entire length of the garden up for 3 meters down, and they've got the line of all the foundations.
Well, interestingly enough, the results of that archaeological dig haven't been properly published. They did, I think they published interim findings, but they never published the actual full dig, along with a whole variety of digs. There's a whole series of digs that took place in Gloucester in the 60s and 70s with all of the lovely, fantastic development that took place that we all love. But the dig findings were not often published in full, and I know that there is a movement to try and publish all of them in the next year or so. So actually there should be an awful lot of information that's not really come out, because I've got a whole section of the interim findings, but the final publications are...
Is there any possibility of getting the Golden Minster republished?
I have no idea. I don't know.
That was what I was going to mention. It was on sale in the museum until relatively recent years, and I'm sure the library would have a copy of it. There's an excellent book about the Golden Minster. And can I just say that one of the most important discoveries they made, the excavations went on 74 to 77, there were 3 seasons, and one of the staggering things they discovered was that St Oswald's Priory had a crypt.
Yes, it did.
And the dimensions of it and the plan of the priory was an almost exact replica of the church at Repton, which is very near to Tamworth.
Yes.
She will have known, because her mother was Mercian and her grandmother, that the Repton crypt was one of the most important pilgrimage centres.
Yes.
And I think that was her inspiration for what she founded in Gloucester, because that property, that area had been lost to the Vikings, and when she was creating the new court centre, she wanted something here that repeated that, and she then went after the bones of St Oswald to endow to it.
And we know that she took inspiration in her designs from areas that she knew. So when she redesigned the street plan of Gloucester, the east side was an exact replica of Winchester. And yeah, I mean, it's an exact replica of the Royal Mausoleum at Repton, and so she was trying to redo that. And we know from other evidence, certainly in the late 10th and into the 11th century, that Gloucester was a major site of pilgrimage because of partly her, but obviously St Oswald as well. And so that's absolutely what she was trying to recreate.
She actually founded tourism in Gloucester, if you look at it that way.
You can say that, yeah.
Long before the cathedral.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely predates it by some time in that way. Yeah, sorry.
Could you tell me how they communicated to plan these battles that were so far apart in the country, and yet they coordinated it to do it at the same time? What was the method of communication?
Well, I mean, she travelled, Aethelflaed, but in common with all people in the Middle Ages, and actually we could argue it was the case right up until probably the Stuarts. They didn't base themselves in one place. They were constantly travelling around all the time because safety was in movement. If you stayed in one place for too long, you became a target. And so her and Edward would have had times when they met, and they would have met extremely regularly. And you know, there's no direct evidence that there are a few records of charters, and there's a few records of meetings that took place. There's one of, for example, there's a really good contemporary record of a meeting, actually not with Edward, but with Alfred and Aethelflaed and Ethelred in London, just before Alfred died. And so these meetings would have taken place extremely regularly, and they would have coordinated their plans based around, you know, the calendar that they operated. But what's interesting is if you look at the dates of some of the starts of construction phases, they are mapped almost exactly to the day. It's remarkable. And if you look at the coordination of battles when they went to Derby and to Colchester, they're timed, you know, incredibly closely. And actually the strategy of the idea, what I find quite interesting, I was talking to some people I know that are armed at the Allied Reaction Corps over in Barracks, military people, and I was trying to describe the concept of these burhs and these fortresses as islands of power that you could then project out on. And one of the American colonels there told me, well, that's what aircraft carriers are for. And the idea of an aircraft carrier that the Americans effectively invented 50 years ago is just a copy of Saxon burhs. The idea that you have this central power base that nobody can touch, and from there you radiate power. And so an aircraft carrier group might only be 5 miles across, but it can project power across 2,500 miles. A Saxon burh might not be on that scale, but they were designed to be within 20 miles. You were 20 miles from a burh if you were in Mercia or Wessex by 917. So you were safe, you could get away, you could be protected behind the walls and not be touched, but then they could build their armies up behind the walls in safety and blow out and take control. And that's exactly what they did. But the coordination of the two things, the way that they built in Wessex and Mercia, in vulnerable parts, what's really interesting, they identified the vulnerabilities within their defensive system and they repaired them. They identified it and they fixed it and then moved on to the next place. And it's incredibly clever.
I think one of the things as we're designing there, in those days things happened a bit slower than they do now.
Yes.
But also, they would almost certainly have a corps of couriers and scouts,
Yes.
light fast horses, young guns on them, that could ride 200 miles in a day and then
Oh, absolutely. But what's interesting, we assume that these things take years and years and years to build, and if you look at, I don't know, the cathedral, as we mentioned the cathedral, the original Norman cathedral took 11 years from when they built it in stone, from 1089 to 1100 to build it. And in that time they only built the choir and 2 aisles of the nave. Saxon burhs were constructed astonishingly quickly. They were built in 2 a year through the 9, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. They were built in 2 a year. You know, they didn't hang about these things. And they used, you know, in the way that in Gloucester, but equally in Hereford and in Worcester, she utilised the Roman walls and they used Roman building materials. St Oswald's Priory was originally constructed, the first phase of it was constructed from fallen down Roman brickwork. You know, so they utilised the Roman ruins effectively, but equally they utilised the Roman roads and the Roman streets. And if you map out the way that they access, certainly on the western side of Mercia, they were using the Roman road network. When they expanded into Derby, attacked Derby, they were using the old Roman system. So she used what was there in front of her, and you know, very, very clever.
How mixed up were the populations at this time? Because you said at the beginning there are different kinds of Vikings to do with different kinds of Saxons. I just think we've got this Mercia and then you've got the Viking lands, but how many of the original populations would still be in the, you know, is it black and white that, you know, everybody was Viking, or do we have any idea how the populations were mixed up?
No, I mean, there would have been mixing, and certainly after, I mean, the thing is, up until 865, the Vikings first came sort of towards the end of the 8th century, but they were lightning plates. They would come and they would have a raiding season and destroy everything and steal everything. I mean, poor old monks up at Jarrow had a hell of a time for decades. To the extent that they carried the body of St Cuthbert for year after year after year in a stone and lead-lined coffin, and to carry him around to avoid the Vikings. But they always went home. But in 865, when they settled, from one of the natural progressions from settlement is there will be intertwined relationships. It happened when the Romans came in the 1st century. When they first arrived, there would have been a very clear, distinct Roman-British. But within a decade or two, they'd started, you know, having relationships and children being born that were Mono-British, and then that continued, and exactly the same would have happened. And equally, with the idea of Wessex and Mercia, there would have been a time when they were completely distinct tribes and they would have operated completely separately. So in the 7th century you had Mercia as a whole, but then you had subdivisions within Mercia. So here, around Gloucestershire, it was the Wiki were a sub-kingdom, if you want, of the Mercians. But over time, the relationships, they would have intermingled an awful lot. And as somebody's already said, Aethelflaed herself was part Mercia. You know, she was descended partly through the Mercia line as well as through the Wessex line. So clearly at the highest levels of society, there was a lot of intermarriage between the royal families and the noble families, the earldoms, and all this sort of stuff would have intermarried. So,
presumably all the Anglo-Saxons didn't move out when the Danes moved in.
well, if you think so, the East Mercians who lived around this area would have been forced into West Mercia with the Danes, thanks to the treaty that Alfred signed with Guthrum, which created the Danelaw and the King of Guthrum. The population, the native population living in this area, would either have had to acquiesce, which a lot of them did, to the Viking rule, but some of them would have forced themselves south and west. And so you get intermingling in two different ways. You'd have got the ones that stayed mingling with Vikings and the ones that didn't mingle with the people in Wessex or in Mercia. But actually, I talked as well about the settlement of a Viking community, the deliberate decision to settle one up here on the Wirral. Well, they were a relatively small group when they first came to the Wirral, but they expanded and they grew, so they must have been intermingling, or however you describe it, with local populace. And this is actually how Normandy, Viking Normandy was established. It was exactly the same model that Aethelflaed used up in the north of Chester, was how the Vikings got established in Normandy, and became the Normans that came and conquered us in 1066, which they were invited in as a buffer, but then Vikings became Norse Vikings, Norman Vikings became Normans, and you know, that's where we go from there.
There's about 100 people at this particular meeting who are obviously all interested in hearing more about her. And she's such an unknown person, really. So how do we get her better known? How do we perhaps think of some statue or something that could be put up?
Well,
how would that start?
I think that has happened in a number of ways. Firstly, the best way is by word of mouth. It's the same as anything. You know, things, campaigns, whatever, always succeed more by word of mouth. So people need to talk about it. We need to get her out and more widely known. So everybody here, if you all go home and tell 2 people about Aethelflaed, then that's 300 people who know. If they tell 2 people, and it grows exponentially. But what we need is actually have a plan. Because coming up in the not that distant future is a really good anniversary. She died, we know she died, in June of 918. So in 4 years' time, we've got the 1100th anniversary of her death and her burial in Gloucester. So what I think we've got to do, and this is where Ben, hiding in the back, who's taking full responsibility, and Jason, who's as I said, the chief exec of Marketing Gloucester, this is all their fault. But what we've got to do is come up with an idea. What do we need? Do we want a statue? Or do we want something different, something more than that maybe? But we've got 4 years. We've got until June of 2018, I think. But the first step in anything is just talking about it and getting her name better known. I would imagine, well, we had Gloucester Day in town on Saturday, and it was packed, it was good fun. But I bet if you walked down the cross and you spoke to 100 people that said, who's Aethelflaed? If one person even knew the name, I'd be amazed. And that's the first challenge, is getting her name more widely known. But I think once we start doing that process and it becomes a movement, then we pick a really key defining thing that we can do for June 2018, the 1100th birthday, or anniversary, sorry, of her burial here in Gloucester, and we make a big deal out of it, because Tamworth, right, I mean Tamworth, really, all these claims, they built a statue 100 years ago for that, and that's fine, and she fortified them, and that's lovely. But she fortified loads and loads and loads of places. She didn't build a priory, she didn't bring the saint here, and she didn't get buried here. Right? So I think we should, I don't see why Gloucester cannot be the spiritual home of Aethelflaed, and that's what we should be.
Chris, can I just mention that Trish and Heather over here, I've been working with them, we're looking to try and create an exhibition in 2060, and who knows, by then it would have gone around the country and come back to Gloucester in 2018 to celebrate 1100 years of her death. But there's work going on at the moment, and these two have been using their own money, travelling up and down the country to find out about Aethelflaed and wanted to go to visit Repton and to Warwick and places like that as well.
It's not just an exhibition, it's a whole festival.
If you looked even a couple of years ago, the Anglo-Saxons wasn't a trendy period of history. It wasn't something that people talked about. There were never any programs about it. And you know, with Michael Wood doing his series that he's done, there's more books coming out. You know, it started to become much more popular. And so she's figuring much more prominently in the narrative. But whether it's an inbuilt misogyny, I don't know. But if you look historically at any accounts, certainly of Gloucester, and I can speak with some degree of authority at the moment because I'm about to finish writing a new history of the city. And you look back at all the ones that have been written over the last 300 years, going right back to Atkins in the 1700s. Atkins, earliest history of Gloucester, doesn't mention it. She's not mentioned in any histories of Gloucester actually until relatively recently. But the Victoria County history that only came out 2 decades ago was a huge, thick tome, massive book that tells a legend, the complete history of the city. Aethelflaed mentions rates less than a page. You think, and this is the problem that has existed for centuries, is that for whatever reason it may be, whether it's inbuilt misogyny, whether it's because Saxon England isn't a particularly trendy period, or whatever it is, she just hasn't been talked about in any historical record. She doesn't really exist in these books, and that's what is slowly changing, and it's changed even over the last 5 or 6 years, and certainly as we go forward, it's absolutely becoming more popular. But the example that that we can use for trying to make Aethelflaed increase her influence and increase people's awareness of it is Richard III, because if you go back 100 years, Richard III was the most maligned person in this country, and it absolutely was. You know, I gave 2 talks in this very room actually last year on Richard III, and I found this fantastic story that there was an assassination attempt on an American president in the 19th century, and the guy who did it was mad. He just popped up the president, shot him twice, didn't kill him. But on his trial, he said, you know, he goes, well, I'm Richard III, you know, I'm the most evil man who's ever lived. And this is the perception of him. But, you know, early part of the 20th century, the Richard III Society was founded with a view to challenging people's perceptions and his perceived reputation by actually doing some real historical research and, you know, presenting him in a slightly different way. And over the last 50, 60, 70 years, it's changed the perception of him enormously. And obviously with recent finds in Leicester, the reinterment of Richard in March of next year, the programmes that have been there, I mean, we had Philippa Langley, who led that, was in this room giving a talk, and all the other people around it, Phil Stone, who's the chair of the Richard III Society, and if you talk to them, the way that the public perception has changed is simply because they would talk about it, and they would say, well, hang on a minute, what about this, what about that? And it's that talking and creating a dialogue that then produces change. And that's what we need to do with Aethelflaed and say, hang on a minute, yes, it was 1100 years ago, but actually it's important, because what they did 1100 years ago, we are still living the effects of it now. And all of us who live in this city live the effects every time we walk through the city centre, because it still hurts to a large degree, you know. And so that's how we do it. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, you said there's going to be more in-depth talk, and obviously you'll probably do this next year with the Ipswich talk. You're only going to talk to a limited audience, and insights are changing that. I'd like to see a statue, you know, Marathon Gloucestershire, they're all about promoting Gloucester, about hidden gems, we don't tell history, we simply don't show it. We've got lots of visitors, we've got tour guides and that, they can take some event at a certain time, we only do it during a short season anyway. Could we not just have one of these visual information boards with more information on it? At least it gets people talking and raises awareness that way.
Well, I think there's an awful lot of different things that we can do, and you know, even things like websites on the website.
I don't think we've spoken. My mistake.
Run by the City Council. Those sort of things should have stories on there. We do have a very brief page on the City website about the history of Gloucester. It's just, well, I made a fatal mistake. Well, no, this is what I mean. I made the fatal mistake of looking at it, and it's just diabolical. And they're the kind of things, they're easy things to do, and start changing the message a little bit. You know, the museum has got a significant role to play in how we do that as well. So there's lots and lots to do.
Another point, I don't know if I'm confusing with somebody else, but was there not an alternative version that she was were they still going the well?
No, kind of.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
I hope it's not a mischievous question. Why was Heineberg chosen? Was it just because of the similarity today? That was why it was so important.
Heineberg was chosen for the memorial thing, because she was the first abbess of St. Peter's Abbey when it was founded. It was founded by Osric, who was Prince of Mercia, who was a sub-prince of the Kingdom of the Queen. And in 679 he founded the abbey here in Gloucester, and it was designed originally, it didn't last very long, but it was originally designed as a dual house, so it was nuns and monks. Effectively it was run by the nuns, and the monks did all the liturgical work and they did all the heavy lifting and carrying. And the first abbess was Osric's sister, who was Heineberg. And so she founded the abbey, and she ruled it for, I think, off the top of my head, it was 27 years. She brought it great wealth. She managed to persuade the king to give an awful lot of land and an awful lot of wealth and endowments. And she ruled for 27 years. She was then succeeded by her kinswoman, and then after she died, by another one of her siblings. So it was 3 women who ruled the abbey. So I think that's why she was chosen, because.
So you don't think that was an opportunity in this?
But yeah, absolutely.
Can I just help with that? I think St. Heineberg we've got was actually donated and donated by somebody in memory's wife to the God.
Is that the one that's in the cathedral on the south? I think we built a memorial on the site where the well was, yeah. But they're the kind of things that we need to look for opportunities to celebrate. But I think what we need to do, to be honest, is if we're going to do something for Aethelflaed and look at 2018 as the year to do it, it's got to be something big. It can't be a little, let's put up an information board. We've got to do something that's spectacular
No, I mean,
and grabs people's attention.
To raise awareness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We need to do something. Yeah.
Going back to the Bangsburg, is that what's known as the steeply back is the well?
Yeah.
How many people that are well,
Nobody.
they walk past it?
Nobody.
Will we learn from that? That's
Yes.
not a fitting memorial
No, it's
for
not.
anybody, whether it's high school. Will we learn from that?
Well,
The people that modern art,
A new interpretation board has been commissioned.
a
for
new
that.
interpretation board has been
Well,
commissioned.
it's
It's
going
going
to
to go
look
up
at
there.
that. If it was a statue, they might go and look at it, but it looks like a steeple back. They're trying to cross the road. I'm not trying to do it.
No, I know. I think it's.
Is it a learning?
Yeah, no, it is. And what we're going to do, but you do this and you learn from them and you make sure you don't do it again. So.
I mean, surely what you've just said is we've had Heineberg, who's a very influential woman, with there were 3 generations of her, and we're also talking about Aethelflaed, who's a very, and they're...
We're the feminist centre of Britain, we are.
Yeah, really, that's very powerful.
No, absolutely, no, I completely agree.
And that is really something that...
That is a point to get across.
It is a point, absolutely.
We talk about girls and role models, I mean, what more do you want?
Well, we try and do this, and I handed over as mayor in June of this year, and I stood up and made a speech and handed over the chains, all that sort of lot. And my successor is a woman called Deborah Welling, the new sheriff. This year is a woman called Lee Snopes. And I said in my speech then, we live in a city that the most important religious institution, now the cathedral, was founded by a woman and was run for the first 50, 60 odd years by women. The street plan that we still follow was laid out by a woman. The defence of the city was founded by a woman, and now the civic leaders are 2 women. We should do more of that sort of stuff. You know, but honestly, it's